The border drawing was one element in addition to other elements that were going to change.
The idea that because you belong to an ethnic category, you behave a certain way or you have loyalties in a certain way do not apply here.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello, welcome to the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations. My name is Leonid Motz and I do science communication for RECET. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Hannes Grandits and Katharina Tyran to our podcast. Hannes is Professor of Southeast European History at Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany, and Katharina is Associate Professor of Slavic Philology at the University of Helsinki in Finland. You may know Katharina from an earlier episode of our podcast series where we talked about South Slavic Vienna. We're here to discuss the Disputed Austro-Hungarian Border, agendas, actors, and practices in Western Hungary, Burgenland after World War I. A volume Hannes and Katharina edited with Ibolya Murber, published with Berghahn this year. I'm happy to have you here with us in Vienna.
Thank you for inviting us.
Before we start exploring the Austro-Hungarian borderland in more detail, could you give us a short overview on where we are situated geographically and historically, and what made the Austro-Hungarian border a disputed one in the first place?
This book and our research was about the disintegration of empire. So after World War I, it was meant and also decided in the peace negotiations that there won't be a continuation of the existing Austro-Hungarian Empire. The question was, what are the following way of organizing state structures on the territory that existed as a joint territory of the Habsburg monarchy over so many centuries before? And it was not so easy to decide about where to draw borders between this or that region. Maybe we have to remind that the Habsburg Empire came into being as a conglomerate of different kind of duchies, kingdoms, counties and others. And now the new vision was that it should be replaced by nation states. And there's a little bit the context that the book is zooming into one of the very much disputed border drawing process, also not so much present in hitherto historiography, is where to draw the border between the new envisioned Republic of Austria and the new Hungarian nation state. And this is the topic of the book because it was more conflicting and I think more disputed than usually it's in present day discussion aware of this.
And how did ordinary people in Western Hungary or Burgenland experience the disintegration of the empire? And did this really change the patterns of their everyday life?
In most of the research, the perspective is a little bit like decision makers in different kind of political positions regarded this. So the everyday life perspective that you addressed is usually not in the focus of most research. And I think our book project was to bring this together. So decision making in Paris, international levels, this kind of disputes between Budapest and Vienna, and the way what's going on the ground. It was highly relevant to the people, but maybe the border drawing was one element in addition to other elements that were going to change. To one degree is after the ended war, there was just the return of soldiers that really went through a horrible period. But also on the home front, the people went through difficulties to make a living and to survive. And now after everything ended, the problems did not disappear, but remained to be on the place. In addition, there was this border drawing process. Maybe just one example was that in this kind of economy of scarcity, trade and smuggling across the border was a big issue. Also the way where you have your working place and what the visions would be for making a living, this came together.
And what role did language play in shaping identity in Burgenland, specifically for minority groups which now had to deal with being part of a nation state? How was this dealt with first on a policy level? And how intertwined were categories of language, ethnicity, and identity before and after the end of the Habsburg Empire?
Well, I think what makes this region specifically interesting is that it is one of the many, but still one of the specific, very multilingual areas in this whole context of the Habsburg Empire. So people on the ground for sure spoke more than one language. They maybe did not speak them all on a level of what we consider today standard language, but they kind of found their way around in several varieties and languages. So this was kind of the reality. On the other hand, we see for this area that kind of these ethnic boxes that appeared specifically after World War I did not really fit, and all these categories did not really fit with this idea of if you speak a language, you have to be loyal to a specific nation or to a specific ethnic group. So this is the one factor that we tried also to discuss in the book, that actually it was this interwar period, or already the time during World War I, showed that in such a region you have a lot of fluidity going on. You have a lot of different ways how you can decide who you want to be at certain points. For instance, I focused in my contribution on one specific activist from the Croatian minority who himself wrote his name in at least 3 different ways, always depending on the question whom he was speaking to or whom he addressed. And this was the normal way of doing this. So when he wrote to a Hungarian colleague or a Hungarian audience, he signed as János. And when he wrote to German-speaking colleagues or audience, he signed as Johann. And in the Croatian context, he was Ivan. And this was kind of completely normal on the ground. But exactly after World War I, people kind of have been forced to decide for one box, which was often hard. And what we can see then, kind of in a second step, or as a second important thing, is that this idea of monolingualism and of standard language ideologies specifically really kind of took ground in the area. It has been often also adopted by minority communities who then, for instance, try to adopt this idea of a standard language to varieties that before that have not really fitted in the concept and did not really need to fit in the concept. But now then, kind of there is this idea that standard language is actually the only thing that makes you a group and that makes you articulate something like an identity. And maybe a third aspect I would like to stress in this context is that we can see that specifically with the Austrian nation building after World War I, these groups that did not fit into this new imagined concept of an Austrian identity have been strongly included as the others that you always need to shape your own identity. And in the Burgenland or Western Hungarian context, we see that this has specifically been the Roma and the Jewish population that have been now construed as the other. And that this kind specifically, although we had conflictive situations already before World War I, it was specifically after World War I that this was kind of included in this overall narrative of what makes a nation. So there are really interesting points in the Burgenland context here on several levels in this context.
If I may add here, maybe to what I said earlier, regardless the linguistic backgrounds, the people had to survive this crisis period. Yeah? So most of the concerns of the people were not related to their language or multilinguality in this transition period, but it was like, how should I get through this crisis period? This was one element. And what also is important and maybe is particular in this book is extreme class tensions that erupted. So we know that the Bolshevik revolution in dissolving Tsarist empire and replaced by the Soviet Union and the civil wars that went hand in hand. But there was also a short-lived Bolshevik experiment in Hungary, the so-called Republic of Councils, that also took over power. And for a short period of time, something similar happened in Bavaria. So in between was the Austrian Young Republic. What is often not so present in present-day historiography, but also in memory, is in this region that are now Burgenland, there was also this short-lived Berghahn regime, which also established its control up into the small villages where councils were taking over village control. This Republic of Councils somehow collapsed, and there was a kind of a restorative regime. Later on, the Horde regime took over. And what's interesting now, during the Red period, there were this kind of red terror against aristocratic landowners, against all different kind of representatives of the old order. And now it turned around, and the white terror, it was against all the leftists, all those who were regarded somehow bound to this. So these class tensions were extremely important for the daily realities. And also the way after this was over, it somehow was so present in the way the people located their way of belonging to what. And actually, when the first elections took place in the region, this was a big topic. So the class element, adding to this one, to the linguistic one, and usually we tend to overestimate the importance of the national story, which was as well somehow part of the whole story, but we have to see the whole story and not take out just the national dimension.
And I would maybe also add to that that really in the Western Hungarian and Burgenland context, and I hope that we really show this in the book, you can see that the idea that because you belong to an ethnic category, you behave a certain way, or you vote a certain way, or you have loyalties in a certain way, do not apply here. So we have people speaking German as their first language who have been very big advocates for Hungary. We have people speaking Croatian as their first language who are either advocating strongly for Austria or strongly for Hungary. We have people speaking Hungarian, voting for the Austrian side. This idea that today is often out there that it's so easy that you decide for one ethnic box and then you behave in that way. In Burgenland, this really does not apply. And I think that this is something that we can really learn here, that it's way more complicated. Class is super important. Of course, language is important, but also the economic situation, the political situation. So everything is kind of intertwined. And I think this case example really nicely shows that.
It's very interesting because if we think about the beginning of the interwar period, this Wilsonian concept of people's self-determination comes to our mind. And I think in your volume, you problematize the identification of this concept with what you call the national story only. Why is Burgenland a particularly suitable example to show this?
The self-determination was a breakdown of the old order, was understood differently in the beginning of the new order. And the new order was, for many, expected to be more fair, somehow taking more care of the will of the people. There should be, just to remind, the first election in 22, where all the female population was eligible to vote. Never before, now yes. So there was a lot of new, and now the people will decide about their future. And of course, some understood it in national terms, but many others understood it also as a kind of a new beginning into something that was not so really predictable. This Wilsonian concept can be understood in the national terms and was in national terms also part of the game. But for many contemporaries, it was more. 1/3 or more of the land holdings, fields and property was in the hand of aristocratic landowners. And the question was, is this fair? Yeah, should it be changed? The other way around is, who will govern local bodies and also regional ones? Is it the established elite? Or is it now, with the new approach to self-determination, that also common laborers have a say? All of this class aspect in it should not be underestimated.
And now probably the million-dollar question, what can we learn from this history for today? What are the legacies of what you're looking at?
Maybe one impetus for this book was that we were not extremely happy about how this kind of 100 years of Burgenland were on the way to be prepared. And we realized also that there are fantastic historiographers. I mean, we somehow continue knowledge about that, what other colleagues have done before. But it's very often the case that it was done more as a history of the making of the Burgenland, or the way of the history of losing our Western Hungarian provinces. Yeah? And most often it was on the one hand done by Austrian historians or Hungarians. And we thought, let's discuss it differently, because in late 1918, no one would have known that something like a province which then got the name Burgenland would be established shortly afterward. It was not written in the stars. It was an outcome of something, of international actors, of national, what I mentioned before. And I think that looking in the way how this establishment of a border, where a new province, I think that this fresh approach that we hope to have given in our book can make an important contribution to the discussion.
And I would also like to add that one thing that in my eyes is very special for this volume is that it is multi-layered and multidisciplinary. So this was really also an intention to bring together different disciplines discussing the region, and because we can learn really a lot if we kind of engage in this dialogue across disciplines. So for instance, one of the chapters discusses the role of geographers who retrospectively helped in imagining and shaping this idea of what Burgenland is from a today perspective. If we look back, we see that actually we have different actors on the ground who shape the understanding of what this region makes. We can discuss this because we included also different perspectives from different angles and from different disciplines. So it's on the one hand side kind of bringing together both an Austrian perspective, a Hungarian perspective, and an international perspective, and different disciplines in a dialogue showing that how such a region is made in a certain sense.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.